Hello and welcome to my channel, Voluptas Oculorum. It means pleasure of the eye. My name is Stephanie, and in today's video, I'm putting this 24 color ocean themed palette from Paul Rubens to a real world test. I'll also be chatting openly about my thoughts on accepting free products for review in a YouTube landscape that feels kind of saturated with undisclosed sponsored content. The painting you're seeing here is a quarter sheet watercolor landscape of the rugged east coast of Barbados, created entirely with this curated palette. It's actually a housewarming gift for my mom. Bathsheba Beach is a place where she and I have spent a lot of quality time together. And since she recently moved into a new home, I really wanted to paint something for her walls that I knew she was going to love. Getting the color and atmosphere of this piece right really mattered to me. In using this palette, I wanted to know whether it could hold up to a real finished artwork, not just a set of pretty swatches or a postcard-sized test piece. So I put it through its paces. I did a couple of beachside warm-ups in my Handmade Arches watercolor sketchbook, analyzed the pigments, tested the mixing ranges, and even discovered the use of a rare discontinued pigment. Please join me for a closer look. Now, it's time for a little chat about gifted content. I want to address the elephant in the room because this palette was sent to me for free by Paul Rubens. I know there's a lot of skepticism around gifted content, and honestly, I share those exact same feelings. When the relationship between a creator and a brand isn't clear, it makes me a little suspicious. So here's exactly where we stand. This is a gifted product, not a paid sponsorship. No money has exchanged hands, and I'm not bound by a contract. However, because I received the product in exchange for a review, YouTube's terms require me to check the paid promotion box when uploading. I know this label puts a lot of people off because they assume it means I was paid to say something, paid promotion. But playing by the rules matters. To me, seeing that disclosure is actually a signifier that a creator has the guts to be honest about their relationships, even if their video is going to take a hit on views. I run a very small channel, but I still decline the majority of PR requests I receive, usually because they seem a little scammy or they just don't fit my practice. They're just not products that I would really want to use. But I accepted this one because the Ocean Palette has been on my wish list for a while. In fact, I was literally staring at the buy button on Amazon when I got an email from a rep at Paul Rubens. They originally offered to send me a student grade palette, but I pushed back and said I'd only really feel comfortable testing the ocean set. Pushing back on a brand's marketing agenda to ensure that you only endorse what you genuinely want to use is another sign that you can trust a creator's opinion. Now, I've also spent my own money on Paul Rubens before. I bought one of their professional sets a few years ago. It had some of these really fascinating discontinued pigments, PO49 and PR206. And I've also purchased their Meliang 52 color student set, which I also bought as a gift for my sister because I thought it was a great beginner option. So I never want to be that YouTuber who just uses a product once for review and then throws it in a drawer. I am only accepting products that I feel I can really stand behind. Some brands try to give creators talking points or ask to review videos before they're posted, but my policy is non-negotiable. No brand ever sees my videos before they go live, and I don't take talking points. Paul Rubens has been really supportive of this. They value my authentic feedback, and they told me that even if I chose not to make a video about this product, they really wanted my honest feedback about it so that they could pass it on to their design team. So if something performs poorly, you, my audience, and the brand will hear it plainly. Finally, let's talk about where this palette is made, because I feel there's sometimes an unfair and unconscious bias against Eastern art brands, with people assuming that they're just like cheap imitations, and I don't work that way. I judge a paint by its chemistry and its behavior on the paper, not by its price tag or its country of origin. I reserve my judgment until I've thoroughly tested a product to my own satisfaction, not to the standard of anybody else. Now, with that said, let me know in the comments how you feel about gifted content and reviews. Do you share that skepticism when creators give glowing reviews but never use the product again? And as a twist, what's a traditional Western brand that hasn't lived up to the hype for you? Now, speaking of chemistry and pigments, let's get down to swatching. Swatching 24 colors always tells you something, but what you're really doing is having a first conversation with the paint, just seeing how it behaves before you ask anything of it. The first thing I noticed is that Paul Rubens has designed this set to heavily favor single pigment colors, which for mixing is a good decision. You get cleaner secondaries, more predictable neutrals, and more control over your washes. Cobalt blue is PB28, which you would expect. Their cobalt turquoise is also PB28, which is not uncommon. I'd say about half my cobalt turquoise paints in other brands are PB28 and about half are PG50. Personally, I prefer the PG50 version, but this one functions just as well, and cobalts are known to be highly light fast. I'm just going to pause the video so that I can pop the pigment codes and numbers up on the screen as well as their ASTM ratings. So out of all of these, we have 15 single pigment colors. The rest are mixed pigment colors. And of these, 18 are rated as excellent on the ASTM scale. The others are all ASTM 2 except for one, which is highly fugitive. And we're going to talk about that one soon. Now for me, some of the pigment highlights in this palette include the translucent turquoise, which is a PB16. And this is also known as a phthalo turquoise, and I really love this color. I actually use it in a lot of my palettes, so I'm really happy to see it here. I was also pretty excited that there was both a quinacridone magenta with PR 122 and a more unique shade of red for a palette like this, perylene maroon PR 179. There's also a cadmium orange PO 20. Now I don't really have any cadmium oranges in my collection, so this was a completely new one for me to test out. But I also love the transparent yellow PY 150. That's like a nickel azo gold, and this one to me feels a little bit cooler toned than some of the ones that I already have in my collection. I think that the inclusion of the perylene maroon, quin magenta, and both warm and cool yellows means that this set could function as a pretty decent basic mixing palette if you wanted it to. If you paint the ocean, I'd love to know what's in your personal palette. Drop it in the comments. Within this palette, there were two pigment stories that genuinely surprised me. The first is sap green. Turn it over and it lists PY153, nickel dioxine yellow. Now that's a discontinued pigment. It's becoming more and more hard to find in modern formulations, and seeing it here made me look twice. It's a small thing, but it suggests that someone made a considered choice rather than just reaching for a standard substitute. Interestingly, you can also find PY153 in the other palette I purchased a few years ago. The second thing is the indigo, and this one I can't gloss over. It's formulated with PB66, synthetic indigo. Now this is a beautiful, moody color, but it also has one of the worst light fastness ratings that you'll find on a pigment. So if you're planning to frame your work or it's going to spend any time near a window, this color is going to fade. Obviously, this is a pigment I want to avoid using in my art, but I had to be really careful during swatching and working not to confuse it with the Payne's gray that is right next to it. Physically, these paints are quite pigmented and they re-wet very readily, which is a pleasure, and they activate into a very thick, creamy consistency in the pan. Some of the paints activated more than I expected, especially the more opaque pans like Naples yellow, yellow ochre, and the cobalt turquoise. If you're used to going directly between your pan and paper, you may need to be a little bit careful to make sure you haven't picked up far too much pigment. And now the flow. I want to talk about the flow because some reviewers that I've seen who have used this palette describe this paint as being very controlled, having low dispersion behavior. But it's interesting because that wasn't my experience at all. On cold press paper, these colors travel and sort of mix together very freely across wet surfaces. You can see here at the end of my swatching where I painted several colors close to each other and let them touch. They immediately run into each other. If you love wet on wet and soft organic transitions, that paint quality is going to feel like a gift. But if you're looking for a paint that stays put and that you can move around yourself, you might find this formulation a little challenging to control. I put together a few quick Barbados beach studies, and this served as an excellent playground for testing the palette's mixing range on a smaller scale. But more than that, they were my first real test of how these paints actually handle. Swatching is a little bit like shaking hands with the paint. It's a safe, controlled introduction. But when you start painting, you have to actually live with your decisions. It's where the paint and the paper and the water, they all come together and every brushstroke becomes like a little mini lesson in timing and moisture. You're really learning like what is the right balance between the water on my brush and the paint on the page. So I selected two reference photos for this experiment. One was a later in the day view with a slightly more dramatic sky and a cresting wave, and the other was capturing the calm, luminous, and almost supernaturally teal water that gently lapped at the shores of Needham's Point in Barbados. My approach here was inspired by the Spanish watercolor master Cesc Farré. I was actually at the International Watercolor Masters Festival last week, and I watched him do a live demo. He has this beautiful tactile way of manipulating wet paint, spritzing the page with clean water and then like lifting it with a paper towel to create these soft, misty spray at the crest of a wave. I tried to mimic that technique on my on this drawing, but it was a very humbling reminder of how much your expertise and your water control can dictate the soul of a watercolor painting. I'm by no means a master at it, but that's the joy of the medium. You're constantly reacting to what the water is doing in real time. For the second study, the calm turquoise waters, I wanted to see how yellows and blues interacted in a wash. So I found that sometimes mixing yellows and blues can result in a flat, muddy green, particularly when you're using slightly more opaque yellows, which a lot of them do tend to be. But using lemon yellow and cobalt teal together yielded this incredibly vibrant, almost like fluorescent green undercurrent. And that really was what I was going for because I wanted to capture that supernatural glow that you see when tropical water refracts over like pure white Caribbean sand. I did try to create this like wet looking pink edge on the sandy beach to mimic the wet shoreline, but my timing was a little off. I allowed it to dry with a hard, sharp edge instead of softening the transition into the paper. But that's the lesson of watercolor. It's always a compromise between your intentions, how wet the page is, and what the pigment wants to do. So this is why I feel it's so important to do warm-ups before you go in for a finished piece. And my sketchbook, this Handmade Arches watercolor sketchbook that I've put together myself, this is the place where I can experiment freely without getting hung up on the final outcome. So with all of my warm-ups complete and a better understanding of how the paints handle, it was time for me to move on to my main painting, which was the gift that I was going to give to my mom. So for this piece, I chose Saunders Waterford 200-pound rough paper in high white, though I'm actually decided to paint on the back side of the sheet because I prefer the texture on the wrong side of the rough paper. So scaling up on a heavy paper like this always presents a physical challenge because you need to keep washes wet for longer and any inconsistencies in the paint's texture are going to show. I relied heavily on that very active dynamic flow that we saw during the swatching to block in the sky and the rolling waves with a large, soft, flat brush. Instead of trying to manually blend every transition, I wet the paper first and let the pigments travel and mingle on their own. For the sky, I used a mixture of cobalt blue and ultramarine, and for the cloud bases, I mixed cobalt blue, earth yellow, and a touch of perlin maroon to create a soft, warm gray. To keep these sky transitions smooth, I misted the paper with a spray bottle while I was working, just to make sure that I had a little more time to work. What the time-lapse doesn't show, of course, are all of the pauses I took to dry the paper with a blow dryer. I did this probably 4 or 5 times in total, and I do that to freeze my layers in place before moving on to the next area. So after the sky, I took on the rock and the shadow below. It might seem like a bold move to put this heavy value in so early, but there's a practical reason for it. I wanted the reflection and the shadow of the rock to appear sort of like merged with the water, sort of under it, rather than floating on top of it. And this is a little trick I pulled up at a workshop recently, and it works really beautifully. Because Barbados is a coral island, the rocks have this gorgeous, multi-toned, slightly yellowy pink background color. So I tried to use as many of the reds, yellows, and oranges in the set as possible, just sort of like adding them wet on wet to the rock and trying to keep the base color of the rock dynamic and reflect its like geological makeup. Throughout this piece, I used a variety of techniques: wet on wet, wet on dry, lifting, and everything in between. So I really wanted to also test out the greens in this palette, and I was able to use almost all of them within the landscape that was on the left-hand edge of the scene. I also used it in the reflections in the water. So we often think oceanscapes, they only require blues and maybe some sunset colors, but the landscape in front of the water plays a huge role in framing the view. So I have actually drawn and painted quite a few palm trees over the years because I do a lot of landscape architecture projects in Mexico. So I have spent a long time trying to figure out how to accurately capture, coconut palm fronds blowing in the breeze. And all that practice came in really helpful here. Finally, I added some finishing touches to the breaking waves using bleed-proof white. This is a very opaque medium that I like to dry brush on with a small flat brush. And I do this after the page is completely dry because that way it sort of catches the tooth of the paper and creates these sort of like skipped wave-like mists, and yeah, just highlights that part beautifully. After removing the tape and revealing the composition, I couldn't wait to get this framed and sent off to my mom. I really hope it brings a little bit of the memory of Bathsheba Beach into her new home. So I've had this palette for a couple of months, and I have been doing tests on and off during that period. And now I think that since I have done so much work with it, I have earned the right to comment on its qualities with some authority. This curated palette has 24 colors, purpose-built for seascapes and marine landscapes, and personally, I found it a joy to work with. That's my honest opinion. The pigment density is high, the single pigment curation is thoughtful, and that active, free-flowing wet behavior is exactly what I love about working with watercolor. But there are a few points of critique I think it's important to point out. The agate brown is a wonderful orange-toned burnt sienna color, but it is the lone earth tone in the set. I mean, there's earth yellow, but that's not really a dark tone. My concern is that if you have to constantly rely on your one pan of brown to mix the shadows with your blues, you're going to run out of that pan far too quickly. And then, of course, there's the issue of the indigo. Replacing the fugitive PV66 pigment with a more highly light-fast dark neutral, like a sepia or a Van Dyke brown, would solve two problems at once. You could remove the fugitive pigment and gain the deep earth tone that the palette currently lacks without compromising the ocean theme at all. It's a meaningful improvement that I really hope Paul Rubens takes to heart and makes in their future editions. I would also have loved to see a few more naturally granulating pigments in the range. I'm used to cobalts and ultramarines having a bit of texture and tooth, but these formulations are processed to be very smooth. Now, some painters prefer that. It's excellent for creating smooth, even skies, but I just found myself wishing for a little bit more of that organic grunge and texture while I was working on the shoreline and on the rocky textures. Like just having that natural granulation, I feel like it really helps bring that realistic texture to things like rocks and shorelines, and that would have been really nice to have. Ultimately, I wanted this piece to feel like a true slice of the east coast of Barbados for my mom's new home. I'm really glad that I went through the process of working on a few test pieces first to get the feel of the paints in real scenes, because I do feel like once I started painting the larger piece, I really knew how everything was going to behave. And of course, it's my mom's job to love everything I paint, but I know you in the comments will look at it with a more critical eye. So what do you think about this painting, the testing process, and this palette? Have I been rigorous enough in my testing? I always strive to provide information that is clear, honest, and genuine because those are the qualities that I value the most in other creators that I watch. I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me today, and hopefully this inspired you to paint something for someone that you love. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.